Hello and welcome to another edition of the Lockton Marine podcast. I am joined today by Stine Tiger Eva, Deputy Secretary General of BIMCO, and Alessio Spraga, a partner at HFW. Welcome to both of you.
Thank you.
Very good to be here.
We are here to talk about FuelEU Maritime, which is something that is already highly relevant to the shipping industry and will become even more relevant at 1st of January 2025. And before we get into some of the finer details, some of the work that you've both been doing with this new regulation, could I challenge you to explain to someone who might not be as familiar with FuelEU Maritime what it is? Alessio, if you would kick us off, please.
No problem at all. There is always a big silence when that question is asked, to be frank. I think, how would I describe it? Well, FuelEU Maritime effectively embodies the principle that the way in which a fuel is produced will soon become just as important as the type of fuel that you're consuming aboard vessels. And what it really means is a significant departure from previous shipping emission regulations, because what it does is it seeks to regulate, in the very first place, the well-to-wake emissions, the entire life cycle emissions of the energy used on board. What that means really is that a business as usual approach, which really involves the use of conventional fuels, won't really help parties going forward. It will effectively mean that they will be paying a FuelEU penalty because the costs of compliance are going to be likely significant going forward.
So, please.
Yeah, I was just going to add to that as well, that it's actually also, it's not really I wouldn't describe it as a phase-in, but it's rather an increased percentage of reduction that will be applicable each year. So you start out with a reduction of 2% in 25, and then it will gradually increase. So it become more difficult, if you like, to actually, or become more costly if you plan on paying your way towards compliance, because the to stay in compliance will be more difficult or require more use of biofuels or alternative fuels than the previous years, because there is this increase built into the regulation itself. So really the intention there is from the EU to move the industry away from traditional fuels towards something that's more alternative, but that will be gradually, and that would also come with its own challenges. But that's the intention behind as well.
So who does it apply to? When we get to 1st of January, who are the ship owners who need to adhere to FuelEU?
I think that's a very good question. I think in the first instance, what you have to understand is that there is a indication on the legislative text that it is the ISM company that has assumed responsibility under the ISM code. Now, where a registered ship owner has, for example, subcontracted responsibility for the ISM code to another party, quite normally a ship manager or technical manager, that manager will be the ISM dock holder, and that party will be in the firing line in the first place. And I mean responsibility for compliance with FuelEU Maritime.
Yeah, and also now we focus today on FuelEU Maritime, but that's also a bit different from the position we had on EU ETS, where the default position ended up after some back and forth within the EU and interpretation and sort of implementing regulation along the way, that it could be mandated to the ISM company, whereas this FuelEU Maritime regulation, so far the understanding is that this is the ISM company only, and that could be, as Alessio just explained, either with the owner itself, if they got technical management internally in the corporate structure, or whether it's a third party manager on a contract that is handling and responsible for the ISM compliance, then also that follows the FuelEU Maritime compliance.
So you mentioned the EU ETS there, which the industry has had a year to familiarize itself with. That applies geographically, right? So it's for trade within and to and from Europe, and it's completely agnostic as to the nationality of the ship owner. Will this be a similar situation where even if it's a regulation that is enforced within a geographical area, it is still a global concern?
Yeah, you've hit the nail on the head. I mean, I would just, it's similar to the EU ETS in that sense. The scope, the coverage is the same, but I would describe it more as having extraterritorial effect, because effectively voyages to and from are 50% in scope and voyages within are 100%. But of course, it doesn't depend on the flag of a vessel, doesn't depend on nationalities. All it does is require an EU touch point.
So any other meaningful differences with the EU ETS? I hear this is a well-to-wake perspective, which I do not believe is the case for the EU ETS, and this is not a tax per se. It's more about the how than the the what and the why.
Yeah, and I think also another difference between the two legislative acts, that is that one where we talk about EU ETS, that is on fleet level really. So that was creating a problem there in terms of compliance, where the managers, looking from their perspective, if they were mandated to take on the responsibility for compliance, then they have to look at the whole fleet, because they, as a company, as a managing company, need to meet the compliance requirements, even though that could be for several hundred ships, really. But the FuelEU Maritime Regulation, that is addressing the single ship. You still need to be compliant, of course, but then it's on ship basis compared to company basis or fleet basis rather. Then you have the pooling mechanism, which I'm sure they will talk about, and sort of pooling it into more vessels together. But on the outset, I think that in reality is also an important difference, that it's ship by ship.
We'll get back to the pooling mechanism, which is a very interesting feature of FuelEU. But if we before that talk about how will ship owners comply with FuelEU? What are their options in order to stay compliant post 1/1?
Compliance means obtaining a document of compliance. Having a greenhouse gas intensity that is either in deficit or surplus does not mean you haven't complied with the document of compliance or with FuelEU. What it basically means is that you have an option on how to comply. Compliance in the base level means paying a FuelEU penalty, and that is attributed to each individual vessel where you have a deficit. However, if you have the opportunity to do other methods, which is banking, borrowing, or even pooling, or even a combination of all of them, there are other ways to comply to obtain that document of compliance.
Which in practice means that will we see more investment in technological solutions, in alternative fuels? I mean, it's impossible to predict, but if you could give it a go, then I'm sure that would be interesting.
I think at least that's the intention behind the regulation, and I think there's also difference from the conversation that we would have today, trying to predict what will happen in 25 and 26, and the conversation that will happen, say, 5 years from now, because there's probably going to be a lot of investments or a lot of thought put into this, how to comply. The regulation would give these various options really, but at company level, that's also a strategic internal discussion to have, based on where do you trade, how often do you call European ports, how is your commercial relationship, what makes sense, what is the cost of purchasing biofuels, where can you get them, are they sustainable, can they be taken into the calculation or used as a tool of compliance, is it easier to pay the penalty, are you in that scale where you are thinking about investments or looking towards alternative fuels to maybe even build your own ability to pool against other vessels within your fleet or outside the fleet. So really, one thing is the regulation itself that is already giving these various tools, but then it's also on company level how to comply, and that's probably a different answer from company to company, and maybe also a different answer today and 5 years from now.
Yeah, I'd agree with Stina there, because at the end of the day, compliance depends on perspective. Because you have all these options, you have the opportunity to do different things. But at its very base level, what you have to think about here is what it means for you, whether you are an individual vessel, whether you are part of a group, or whether you're an operator, whether you have owned or chartered tonnage. And that will really determine what your mindset is potentially to FuelEU. And there are options, as we've discussed. But ultimately, that mindset will probably boil down to whether you're going to treat it as a compliance burden or whether you are going to think about it as a management of risk exercise. And if you're going to think about it as a latter, then the opportunity to ring fence or minimize your exposure across a, say, group of vessels can also enable you to monetize FuelEU. So there are different perspectives.
I'm hearing that the consequences of non-compliance are likely to be penalties or fines or however you choose to label them. Do we know what they will look like? What kind of what size we are talking about? I mean, because would payment of penalties be a way of paying your way out of compliance?
Yeah, it will be, and in a way, you can always discuss whether penalty is the best word for that option, really, because as you say, it sounds like a fine or something similar to that, but it will definitely be a tool or a way towards compliance for several companies, especially in the beginning when the regulation is just entered into force. Also, the availability of alternative fuels. Well, there are a fleet of LNG vessels. There are talks and investments in ammonia, and methanol was also very much discussed. It's still discussed, all of these options in trade winds, shipping media. So there's a lot of activity ongoing there. But that's not available for everyone at all at this moment. So this leaves actually, to a wide extent, paying the penalty as the sole option, unless you can get the biofuels into the mix one way or the other.
Where are we at this point in time? What's the market doing? How are the parties allocating responsibilities, and how are those discussions going?
I think from my perspective, it's a varied approach. Again, it depends on perspective. It depends on what position you are in the charter party chain or the contractual chain. And there are various different approaches. For a large partnership owners, we'll be seeking to try and pass the cost down, or at least subscribe the charterers to a maximum greenhouse gas intensity limit, for example. On the other hand, it depends on the charterer's risk profile as to whether they're going to accept responsibility for that FuelEU cost or penalty, rather, to be passed down. And as Stina said, the reality is there may not be a penalty that's to be passed down, because it depends on how you intend to comply and what fuels you're using on board the vessel. So there are different kinds of conversations going on, especially if we think about the LNG market, because of course the prospect of complying with LNG as a potentially low carbon solution, at least for the next 5 to 10 years, is a different proposition to passing the cost down. The conversation is more about whether you can get access to a potential surplus to be created, which then would feed into how you comply, whether you're talking about an individual vessel, a group of vessels, minimizing your risk, or potentially even monetizing the FuelEU system.
Would you say that the industry is prepared, or are we still going to be having this conversation in a year from now?
I think the industry is just getting prepared. Some have been preparing for quite some time, but I think overall there's still at least negotiations to be had on how to deal with this in a charter party team, but as well organizing their own internal strategy towards compliance. How is the intention to comply with all this, understanding the regulation and the impact? So some of it will only be sort of reality, really, or it's easier to understand as it starts having an impact in the market and it enters into force. So I think the conversation is probably going to be slightly more matured or with more experience a year from now, but it's not like I would say overall the industry is completely ready for this, especially also when we talk about these alternative fuels and all the certification and all of that. That's not completely ready, so there's still questions there that are not fully answered and that the industry will also be looking for.
Mm. We spoke about, we referenced pooling earlier, and we promised we'd come back to it, so now's the time. That is mentioned often as a means of compliance in relation to FuelEU Maritime. Could you, in simple terms, talk us through what pooling means in this context?
Yeah, of course. Pooling in this context effectively means complying with Article 21 of the regulation. There's only one article. There are conditions, they have to be met. I won't go through those, but what I will say in broad terms, the ability to pool really depends on putting vessels which have generated a deficit compliance balance together with vessels which have generated a compliance balance surplus. So those vessels which have been using, for example, RFNBO fuel or more likely biofuel sources. To the extent you can match them, you can then seek to minimize your exposure towards a FuelEU penalty. And the big question, I think, for the next year and a half will be, what is the cost of pooling compared to what is the cost of FuelEU penalty? And if the cost of pooling is less than the penalty, then pooling will be an available market and therefore would incentivize this system that has been created by the EU instead of paying the penalty. But it won't work for everyone.
No. So what is the feedback loop and the review process here? Because if we find ourselves in the situation a couple of years from now where the industry is simply feeding penalties into the system rather than complying, we won't have achieved very much. Is there a process that will look at how this is actually working in practice?
Yes, there is a review process to see how it's gone about. But how I've described this is that it's not just about the greenhouse gas intensity of the fuel that you're using today. It's a question of to what extent RFNBOs are in the fuel mix come 2031, because inbuilt into FuelEU Maritime is a provision which puts basically the building blocks in place to ensure that at least 2% of renewable fuels of non-biological origin, known as e-fuels from hydrolysis and the like, are part of the fuel mix. And what that really means is that if that 2% has not been an uptake from the sector, then the EU have the ability to legislate for what's described as a minimum 1% uptake of RFNBOs. A minimum 2% uptake of RFNBOs come 2034. What that means basically is that if there is not enough e-fuels uptake by a certain period, the EU will effectively legislate for that fuel mix to be incorporated into fuels to be used by vessels going forward, to push, as Stina said, the industry towards using less carbon intensive, less fossil based fuels.
Yeah. So just going to add to that, there will be this review process, but what would also be interesting, that is to see how is the cost of pooling. There are these surplus, there are these gain and those benefits from using those FuelEU Maritime compliant fuels and alternative fuels. So the cost, the surplus that will be you can say the gain from that and how many ships you can offset, and so that benefit, it still doesn't have a sort of a firm figure really. So it depends as well what is actually the cost of the benefits you can get to offset those vessels in the deficit. And again, it depends on how would those, what's the price cap there, the price gap, and what will be the cost of producing alternative fuels. How can you sort of source them or scale them, so there are quite a few factors there that they are interlinked. But to predict what will happen and what will happen in the review process is also difficult, because it really depends on how would the market mature and what would be the cost, because those we don't know exactly what the cost of pooling will be. That depends on the market. And how many ships can actually are out there to offset those ships in deficit. How many ships can actually be pooled as a means of compliance compared to paying the penalty.
So could I ask you specifically on the work that has gone on within BIMCO in developing your FuelEU Maritime clause, and I'm sure there's more coming as well. What have been the key considerations when you've developed your work in this area?
Well, there have been quite a few key consideration, and I think a challenge that we incurred also along the way, which was a bit similar to the one we had when we developed the ETS clauses. That is that the verification and the sort of the validation of the data and your knowledge about whether you are compliant or not, that verification process is happening the year after. So there is a monitoring year where everything is operated, is taking place, the ship is fueled, etc. And then you are into the next year until you actually know was the ship compliant with the fuels, and what's the penalty actually to be paid. So that discrepancy between how is the commercial actors preferring to deal with one charter party at a time, for example, after 5 months, then you don't come back and open up that charter party again to deal with the cost that is only known and incurred the year after. So that has been a challenge to bridge that gap. Well, what we have done in that respect, that is to in the clause make so those charters liable for what's happening only in that period where they have the ship on charter. So dealing with one charter party at a time. And then, of course, there might be some uncertainty on charter's part, whether they are paying too much, or on owner's part, whether they will actually get paid enough, because it might be that they cannot offset or not offset, but they are not actually being supplied compliant fuel. But that uncertainty would just have to be accepted one way or the other. And then it's been dialogue between that if the charters are paying for compliant fuels, say a mix of traditional fuels and biofuels, then that benefit that will be linked to pooling, or even when we talk about other type of ships, LNG, etc., then there is an extra cost for the fuel, and therefore from the charter's perspective and also the owners in the subcommittee agreed that then the benefit will go for the long-term charters to the charters to actually decide on these compliant mechanisms, being banking, pooling or borrowing, roughly speaking. So finding that balance between who is actually paying for this and who has got the capability, not the capability, but rather the right to instruct the owners to do this and that. And then, of course, some owners would prefer to have that right within them because they are going to offset against own fleet. So there are scenarios where a standard clause will have to decide, well, in the subcommittee, we'll have to decide, and we can't cater for all scenarios and all situations, but that's some of the key consideration. I could talk about this for quite some time, but these are some of them that we have considered.
Any early feedback on the clause you put out?
We have seen a few articles out there, and one of the things that is being mentioned is that it's not perfectly fitted for short-term charter parties. There is a mechanism there, but it's true that it's built on if you're supplying traditional fuels, then there will be a penalty. And the argument there would be, well, I only have the the ship on charter for 4 months, why would I pay a penalty? Because it may be that in the end, the owner will not have any penalty to pay because it might be compliant the rest of the year. But still, the consideration there and the sort of the conclusion by the subcommittee is that it will still carry a cost. So the fact that you still bring the ship in deficit, the fact that you have supplied traditional fuel and bringing the ship in deficit as such will be a cost that needs to be dealt with, or a disadvantage, or how you want to phrase it. So that's true. It's not. It could be that there's no penalty there. So that's something we have heard. But otherwise, so far, I think the industry is still digesting. But it has been a quite sort of thorough work that has gone into the development and a good subcommittee. So I hope it will be widely accepted once everybody starts looking into it and negotiating.
I'm sure. Thank you for the insight on that. This is another regulation that is regional. We obviously know that shipping has great global ambitions, and IMO has their net zero ambitions for 2050. How do you see FuelEU Maritime aligning with what is inevitably coming on the global scene?
I think that's a very good question. I think the biggest question will be to what extent and when the global carbon levy or tax, however you want to describe it, and what form that will take, will materialize at an IMO level, and how that will fit in with the global fuel standard and LCA analysis. It's only at that point that we know when it's going to fly and how it's going to fly that we will know what impact this will have on FuelEU. In the meantime, FuelEU will apply, and it will therefore need to be complied with. So the one certainty we have is that it's going to apply from the 1st of Jan, and that real compliance costs will be truly earned and payable in 2026.
Mm. In conclusion, and as a final takeaway, what advice would you give to a ship owner or even someone else in the value chain, so a manager or a charterer, when they are faced with this new regulation?
Yeah, I'd say I guess we would probably say the same, Alicia, but it would be something like you really need to look into it. It's you need to familiarize yourself with what does this mean? What's the impact for my company, for my ships, regardless of whether you are a charter that's being faced with potentially this cost, or you're an owner, or definitely also if you're a third party manager, because it will apply to the third party managers automatically. So it's familiarize yourself, and then think about on the owner side, how do you plan to comply?
Yeah, I would echo what Stina said. I think three key headline topics. First, familiarize yourself with FuelEU, understand what it means to you. 2, review your contracts and understand where you're positioned, what it means for you, depending on whether you are individual, group, and what kind of fleet you operate. And then decide what your compliance pathways are. Only at that point, when you've done all 3, you know what you're talking about and what position you have, what exposure you have, importantly. But one thing I should probably add is that it's not just a ship owner, ship operator, charterer, ship manager issue. The fact that pooling has been allowed for the sort of market, as we say, means that you actually have entrance into the market that will be involved in FuelEU, even though they're not a regulated or a compliance entity. So it is a full global shipping issue sector issue for them.
Stina, Alessio, thank you very much for contributing to the podcast. This has been very enlightening. And to all of you listening, thank you. And we look forward to welcoming you again to the Lockton Marine podcast. Goodbye.